I'm recording. Hello, everybody. We should take a moment to acknowledge the land on which we are gathered for this meeting. For thousands of years, this land has been the home of the Patwin people, including the Yocha Dehe Winta Nation today. The Patwin people have remained committed to the stewardship of this land over many centuries. It has been cherished and protected as elders have instructed the young through generations. We are honored and grateful to be gathered here on their traditional lands. I'm going to hand it over to Mike to introduce Treva, but I just want to mention that I'm going to post the survey in the chat. If you can click on it and fill out the survey, that helps the master gardeners. And I also want to say that I am leaving at around 3:40, 3:45 to run an author talk, but I'm going to leave everything open and Mike will monitor the chat. Okay, thank
Great.
you.
Thank you, Joan. Well, welcome everybody. Today Treva Valentine is going to be talking about how to keep our pets safe from in the garden and how to keep our gardens safe from the pets. And Treva is particularly qualified to do this because she was a vet professionally and is a master gardener, so she kind of knows both ends of this equation really well. And I'm going to show you here. I'm particularly interested because this is our newest family member, Louie. And, I want to learn how to keep Louie safe in our garden. Anyhow, he's been a good little guy so far, but we're going to try to keep him safe. So, all right, Treva, it's all yours.
Awesome, Mike. Thanks. And that's great. I wish I could bring my dogs in here, but they're way too big. But they were little ones. So, like Mike said, we're going to talk about pet and plant safe gardening today. And we're going to start with let's see if I can get my slides working. Okay. Well, I didn't even try this first. Let's see what's going on here. Okay, there we go. Okay, we're good. So first we're going to start talking about the toxins in our garden, not only pets, I mean, not only plants, but other things that could be toxic in our gardens. So toxic plant lists they are so daunting. There are some 700 to 1,000 plants that have some kind of toxic effect. And I'm only going to obviously mention a few of them. So I'm directing you to this particular website, the ASPCA's website, for a listing of all the toxic plants that they have. They keep the site, there's a number of sites online, but I think this is a really good one because it keeps it updated and it's very current. They also have a phone line, a center phone line there that you might want to jot down if you have pets. And then there's a pet poison helpline that is excellent. It's a 24-hour, 7-day a week. They do charge a fee for, for an incident basically. And then they will talk to you a number of times through that incident if you need to. So I think that is something to have kind of, at hand. But just because a plant is on a list doesn't necessarily mean that, your pet's going to be poisoned by it. So just because, it's on a list doesn't mean you can't use it in your landscape. I have a number of toxic plants in my landscape, and I still feel that my pets can coexist with those plants in a safe manner. And I'm going to try to give you some tools for how to do that. And hopefully by the end of this section of the talk, I'll give you some ideas on how to determine what you think can stay in your landscape and what things that you might want to avoid if, depending. the biggest point I have is you need to know what you already have and be mindful of what you add. So, I would just, take a look at your plants, even though you think that they are totally safe, and find out if they are or not. So like I said, plants are toxic, but they've developed, some plants are toxic because they've developed these mechanisms to prevent themselves from being consumed. Some of the mechanisms are totally obvious, right? There's thorns, there's spines, there's prickly hairs. But unfortunately, the vast majority of toxins are chemical. And obviously we can't see those. Plant toxicity is due to a wide range of chemical toxins, and we know of most of them. But there are some, like the lilies, that are toxic to cats primarily. We do not know what it is in lilies that is so literally deathly to cats. So some things we know, some things we don't know. So let's see here. There we go. So let's start off by talking about some of these toxic chemicals that are in different plants. So cyanide. I don't know if you've heard that the apple seeds are poisonous to pets. And it's because there is cyanide in the seed of apples that if chewed, which is a key, the seed has to be chewed to release the cyanide effect in the pet. Now, it takes about 150 to 1,000 apple seeds to cause a real major toxic event. Now, obviously, this picture is not apple seeds. I couldn't find, 1,000 apple seeds. This is wheat, but it illustrates my example that they would need to eat a lot of apples. So obviously apples are on a toxic plant list, but the likelihood of your pet being poisoned by apple seed is pretty low. On the other hand, toyon berries, a pet could consume enough toyon berries that they could have some toxic effect from them. It is the same chemical, so it's a cyanide type of chemical that's in the toyon berry. Also, all the stone fruits in the pit, only in the pit. But again, the pet has to chew the pits. So if you have a bigger dog and it eats one of these plums but it doesn't chew the pit and the pit just goes on out through the intestinal tract, it's not going to harm your pet at all. So that's kind of the story with all the stone fruits. This is another type of toxic chemical, and these are soluble oxalate crystals. There are insoluble, which we'll talk about in a minute. These are soluble. Soluble just means that they go into the stomach and get into the bloodstream. So these oxalate crystals get into the bloodstream, and that's where they cause their issue. The issue is that they tie up calcium in the body, and there are so many processes in the body that require calcium to function, like muscle, like our heart is one big muscle. So these can be really deadly. Now, this is a picture you probably recognize of rhubarb, and that's why we need to cook rhubarb before we can eat it. The vast majority of the crystals, well, not the vast majority, but there are more oxalate crystals in the leaf than in the stem. And the leaf is more likely what a dog, say, would chew on. So, but the stem is more likely what we would eat. But like I said, that's why we have to cook rhubarb to eat it. So insoluble oxalate crystals, that just means that they don't get into the bloodstream. They stay in the location where they land. Like your pet is chewing on something that has insoluble oxalate crystals, then the reaction is in the mouth, in the tongue, in the throat. And that would be examples like Dieffenbachia has issues with these type of crystals in the mouth. There's about 200 plant families that have insoluble oxalate crystals, and one of them is spinach. Now, the reason we can eat spinach, and we can eat spinach raw, is because their crystal is kind of a cube form, more blocky, and it really doesn't cause us any issue in our mouths. So it kind of depends on what type of crystal, that the shape of the insoluble oxalate crystal, as to whether or not it's going to cause an issue. The cardiac glycosides is another group of toxins that can be in plants. And we probably all know that foxglove is poisonous, right? But that's where we got digoxin. Digitalis came from foxglove originally. So it has benefit if you have heart disease, but if you don't have heart disease, then obviously it can be quite poisonous. The oleander is another one that has a cardiac glycoside in it. The really unfortunate thing about oleander is that it has many toxins in it. It is the perfect example of, it's not one toxin per plant. Some plants have lots of different toxins, affect lots of different body parts, and cause a lot of different symptoms. So plants that have many toxins in them obviously are much more detrimental to the body than if there's a single toxin. It takes just a tiny amount of oleander to be toxic. As an example, not that you're going to have cows in your backyard, but it takes a leaf to poison a cow. So oleander is really detrimental. Although, truthfully, I grew up in the southern Arizona desert, and we had probably at least 15 oleander plants in our backyard, where we as children played and all of our pets played, and many people in the southern desert grow oleander without issue. So they're not an attractive plant for animals to chew on, but they are deadly if they did. And one of the bigger problems, especially with food animals, is once the leaf dries and is on the ground, it's still toxic. And if it gets in with feed, then that's usually how animals are poisoned. Lily of the Valley is just another example of a cardiac glycoside plant, and it's any part of this plant that is toxic. Rhododendrons and azaleas. Now this toxin is called a granotoxin, and it is a type of neurotoxin that gets in the body. It affects the GI tract as well. It can also affect blood pressure, other heart changes. So it has a lot of different effects, but it's primarily a neurotoxin. The bad thing, I mean, most of us aren't going to have rhododendrons in their garden, right? But azaleas do grow here. And like this picture shows, an azalea in a basket sometimes is a house plant for a while. You know, they're given as gifts as house plants, and they stay in the house while they're in bloom, and then we put them out in the garden. So, so that's something to think about in the azalea family. One of the bad things about granotoxins are that they can hang out in the body for a while before they show any symptoms. So, you know, your pet could consume an azalea, and it could be up to, 10 hours before you saw any symptoms at all, or it could happen immediately. So we don't really understand why sometimes it has a lapse. The other thing that's bad about this particular toxin is that there's no minimum threshold for toxicity. So like a lot of the toxins, it's known that, you have to eat, 150 to 1,000 apple seeds to be poisoned. We don't really know with toxins how much toxin it is actually toxic in any given animal or person for that matter. Another toxin are the strychnines, and those are also it's a strychnine-like, but it is a neurotoxin that is like strychnine. The plant that one of the plants that is most common is in a shrub, a bush called the yesterday, today, and tomorrow plant. It's called a broomfelsia. They're lovely plants. And I have to tell you, I've got 2 of them in my yard. So the name comes from the flower. The flower starts off this gorgeous, this picture doesn't really do it justice. It's a beautiful blue flower. And then after a day or two, well, more than actually a day, after a while, it fades more to almost a pale bluish pink. And then it goes on to being a white that you can kind of see in this picture. The toxin, however, is not in the plant or the flower. The toxin is in these little berries that are on the right-hand side that are formed after all the petals fall off. So like I said, I have 2 of these in my own landscape. They're not in my pet yard. They are in a side of the yard that the dogs usually are supervised. And my adult dogs have never, in the past, have never had an issue. In the last couple of years, I have gotten 2 puppies. And so now I have very young dogs. And their behavior is really different than an adult dog would be. So I make sure that as soon as these little berries form, I just go out and I pick every single one off. I mean, it takes a little while, but it doesn't take forever. Do I have to do that? Probably not. I've had dogs in my property for, some 30 years and never had an issue. But I have curious young dogs and I know better than I did 30 years ago. So I pick all these berries off. So that's just a way that you can have some of these toxic plants and still feel safe having them in your landscape. So you can see with so many different toxins, those are the only ones that we're going to really talk about. I don't want to bore you with all that toxic stuff. So you can tell with so many different types of toxins, and unfortunately with a number of plants that have more than one toxin, like I said, the oleander and the azalea, and there are many others, they can cause this really broad range of symptoms. So, so it's not just one symptom, one toxin per plant. The other thing to think about is that just because a plant is not toxic doesn't mean it couldn't cause a problem. So, I mean, certainly we have seen dogs and cats both vomit grass especially in the spring. They go out and they graze on the grass and oh my gosh, it's just wonderful, and they throw it up. That doesn't mean the grass is toxic, of course, and that doesn't mean that you have to keep it out of your yard, of course, but it just emphasizes that just because your dog all of a sudden has a scary GI issue, it doesn't necessarily mean it was a toxic event. Okay, so other things to think about. If you bring a bouquet into your house and it has a lily in it, lilies, we're going to talk a little more about lilies and cats and how toxic they are. But we need to be aware that bringing things into our home that maybe don't stay long can also be a little worrisome. You go out, especially, well, not necessarily this time of year, but also in the fall, and you buy a bag of bulbs to plant, and you leave it on the counter, and you have a very curious dog. Bulbs of the narcissus, the tulips, the hyacinths, and a number of other bulbs are extremely toxic to dogs. Not the top part, but the bulb part. So we have to be careful what we bring in, even if we're not putting it in the ground. So most all of the flowering bulbs are toxic, and they cause all kinds of severe GI issues. They do cause some cardiac issues, and they can also cause some kidney issues. So you might think, okay, I don't have pets. You probably wouldn't be at this lecture if you didn't, but say you don't have pets. So I don't have to be that careful. Or my current pets have been in my landscape, and I already notice a number of plants that I've mentioned that you have, that you think, well, my pets have never touched those plants and probably never will. I think as conscientious gardeners, we just need to be mindful of what is in our yards, because we might have pets that visit. Or like me, you might, you had an old dog, now all of a sudden, or like Mike, all of a sudden he has a young dog, and it is going to behave differently as a young dog than our older dogs did. So just being mindful, I think, is important. And I'm not saying that you need to revamp your entire landscape for any eventuality. I think you just, like I said before, you need to know what you have, and you need to be mindful of what you bring in. So, how do you cope with all this, and how do you decide? You see, you go home and you inventory all your plants in your yard, and you find out every single one of them is on, I'm being facetious, but every single one of them is on a toxic plant list. You need some tools to try to help you determine which ones can stay and which ones you might be a little bit careful of. We've talked about the toxins, and now we're going to talk about some of the ways to decide the degree of toxicity in those plants. So the first one is lilies and cats that I've mentioned. Lilies and cats are deadly together. The plant, the stems, the leaves, the flowers, the vase water, the pollen that they rub up against and gets on their coat, and then they groom it off. All of that is extremely toxic in cats, and very often leads to complete kidney failure. So I can't impress enough that lilies and cats are just not a good combination. And like I said before, we have no idea what it is in the lily that causes such a major issue with cats. In dogs, they usually just eat the leaves if they're going to eat anything, and it causes some GI upset. It doesn't even affect the kidneys, to my knowledge. So, it just goes to show that some things are very toxic to one species and not to another. And we'll talk about that. Actually, let's talk about that right now. So, that just explains how one species can be super affected and then another not. But what about differences within a species? So I used to use this classic example of grapes, and because grapes and grape products like raisins are known to be highly toxic to dogs. I worked on dogs that had kidney failure because of eating grapes. And I've also heard many people say, well, my dog eats grapes all the time, and there, there's never been an issue. I feed him as a treat, and it's not an issue. So it took a number of veterinarians. It was actually a group of veterinarians from the ASPCA that actually found out that it is actually the tartaric acid that is in grapes that causes the issue, and that some grapes have hardly any of that acid and other grapes have a ton. So it depends on the variety of the grape. It also depends on the ripeness of the grape. And it also depends on how the grapes were grown. So there's so many variables about grapes that can cause them to be toxic in dogs and other dogs not. So I would be still careful of grapes, but if you hear people say, well, grapes are supposed to be toxic, but my dog eats them all the time, that's why. I don't know that it's a good idea. I have grapes on my property. I let them flower and I cut all of the flowers that are inside the fence off. So I have no grapes that are inside the fence that my dogs can access. Do I know what grapes I have? Yes. Do I know how much tartaric acid is in that variety? No. There's no way to know that without having them tested, because it's also the soil and it's the ripeness. So it's a difficult one. It also depends on the toxin, how much of the toxin is consumed over time. And grapes are also an example of that. Grapes consumed, a small amount of grape consumed quite frequently is certainly worse than one time, should I say. And that's because the variability of the toxin in the grapes. As far as what part of the plant is consumed. And I mentioned this example before, that the bulbs are toxic, but the top part of the flowers and the green part are not. The issue with bulbs also is, they can be, the tops can have died down and you have dealt with the tops and they're gone, but those bulbs are still in the ground. And so if your dog starts digging and happens to dig up some bulbs, then there's a chance that your dog might start eating them. So I think that's something else just to keep in your mind. I do not have bulb plants in my fenced yard where the dogs spend time unsupervised. I have a lot of daffodils on my property, but none of them are in areas where my dogs spend much time unsupervised. And I think that's something just, to think about. I had mentioned toyon, and I wish I had a better picture for you, because truthfully, it's not the red berries that we see right now, or the yellow, depending on the variety. It is actually the unripe greenish black berries that come out before that are the ones that are toxic, that have the cyanide type toxin in them. So it's the glycoside is converted into a cyanide type. So the ones that are out here right now that are, that might be in your landscape right now this time of year, those are not toxic. It's the ones that are in the late summer, early fall that are more toxic. And truthfully, I have some of these berries. I have some toyon bushes in my pet yard, but I make sure that none of the berries are low to the ground. And I feel like that's safe enough. So we all have to make our own decisions. The age of the pet, we've already alluded to that with puppies and kittens. The age of the pet totally matters. Young animals, their metabolism is kind of compromised. They have underdeveloped, systems that make them much more affected by toxins. So we have to really be careful with these little guys. Size of the pet. Holy smokes, of course that matters. Can you imagine the amount of toxin that Chihuahua needs to eat compared to that Great Dane? So you just take that into consideration. If you have a teeny weeny little pet, it makes a difference what plants you have versus if you have Great Danes or you have, bigger dogs. So just keeping that in mind. It also matters, of course, how much they consume. So if they, eat a couple of grapes, probably no big deal. If they're over there just, like munching away, then that could be an issue. So how much is consumed? And like I said before, how much is consumed over time? So the dose of a toxin is per body weight. That's the number one factor. So how much and how big or small the animal is the number one factor for how severe the poisoning is. And some poisonings are just, GI effects, maybe cause a little issue, and others just totally knock out a body system like a kidney. So that's, the severity is important. The condition of your animal. So if your animal already has a heart condition, already has kind of marginal kidneys, plants that it consumes that affect those body systems, they are going to be a lot more affected. Okay. So if you have a nice healthy animal that ate the same amount, it may not even hardly bother them. So that's something to be concerned about. And it also, like I already mentioned, the number of times exposed. Also, it has to do with what's in the stomach. If your pet consumes, a toxic plant on an empty stomach, chances are they're going to throw the whole thing up. If they consume a plant on a partially full stomach, there's a good chance they're not going to throw it up and it's going to stay there and cause its toxic events. Now, we talked about some of the toxins, those insoluble calcium oxalate, or not calcium, but oxalate crystals that affect the mouth. But I'm talking about ones that are consumed that affect the whole body system. Also, something to think about is, and I've kind of alluded to this in my personal examples, is what's the likelihood of your pet getting into a toxic plant that happens to be in your landscape? Is it in the front yard where your pet usually is always supervised? Or is it in a side yard or a backyard or an enclosure where your pet spends a lot of time unsupervised and possibly bored? Bored pets will eat things that they probably wouldn't have eaten if they weren't bored. So that's something to think about also, is where are the plants that may be toxic that are in your landscape. So other things that are not plants, but that are in your gardens, I wanted you to think about as well. Compost piles, mulches, different fertilizers, and the pesticides, herbicides, rodenticides. So compost piles are just a magnet for dogs. Oh my gosh, they love compost piles. And it's, a lot of dogs can eat, not all dogs, but a lot of dogs have almost like an iron stomach, and they can eat things that, would make us so sick. But there are some things that break down in compost piles that then become toxic. And one of the classic examples are peppers. All the peppers, as they break down and ferment and get moldy, they produce a neurotoxin. And I experienced this personally with two of my own dogs that were poisoned by peppers, moldy peppers. Both of them gratefully survived, but it was pretty harrowing experience. So I would be very careful with compost piles in an area where your pets can get into them. Cats are a lot fussier, but dogs for sure, compost piles. The cocoa mulches. Cocoa is the same as the cocoa that goes into chocolate. So the toxic part of what's in the mulch, if dogs eat mulch, and some dogs do, it does smell pretty cool, is the same as in chocolate. And there's a whole realm of, well, a whole, not realm, there's a whole criteria on how toxic different chocolates are. There's some dogs that have eaten chocolate without any issue. That's usually a white chocolate or a milk chocolate. Eating the high cocoa content chocolates can be quite toxic to pets. So the cocoa mulches I would avoid in a pet enclosure area. The fertilizers. Now, generally speaking, fertilizers once applied to the soil are not an issue. However, the fertilizers that are super smelly, like the fish fertilizers, can attract pets to that area. And I inadvertently caused one of my young puppies to eat a bunch of dirt because I didn't water my fertilizer in well enough. And he just, went over there and started munching up the dirt that had a fish fertilizer in it. It actually was it may have been a guano. It was one of those smelly fertilizers. So the biggest way that dogs in particular, or cats, get poisoned with fertilizers is by eating the container. Dogs will eat a container if it smells really great. Cats can lick a container if you have a lot of drippage off the sides of the containers. So fertilizers can be an issue in our pets. The pesticides, the snail baits, the slug baits, a lot of them say that they are, well, a lot of the pesticides say safe around pets. And they are, generally speaking, the way they're applied, or the way they're supposed to be applied. But if a dog got into a whole container of these, that is not how the company expected them to be used. And that can be toxic. So having dogs eat, a whole container. There was a product that used to be on the market. I don't believe it's still on the market. It used to be, it was called Deadline. And it was it was a liquid that you could put around plants for snails and slugs. And that, even dogs eating it out of the garden didn't seem to be an issue, but eating the whole container was a major issue. So it's more of them, getting into the containers. Rodenticides, there's no safe rodenticides. And there are so many, the vast majority of rodenticides that are on the market right now, there is absolutely zero antidote for. So rodenticides don't have any place anywhere near pets. Oops, my finger is jumping around here. It kind of, there's all of these, issues with the myriad of toxic plants. There's, the frequency of their ingestion. There's actually all of these things that, I've been talking about. And I think the question comes up is, so actually how likely is it that my animal is going to be poisoned by a toxic plant? And truthfully, I could not find any specific data that answers that question, because that type of data, it's just really almost impossible to keep track of. It does seem that severe poisonings are not real common, but they aren't rare either. I treated a number of plant poisonings in my career. And so they weren't common. I didn't have, one a month, but I had a couple over my career. And it really doesn't matter how common they are if it's your pet that gets sick, right? So, so if you suspect that your pet has eaten something that you know is toxic, if you're not really sure, but if it's toxic or not, if your pet is acting weird and it resonates with you with something that I might have said, you need to contact your veterinarian. I mean, I wouldn't try to Google it online. I would contact your veterinarian. Now, with a lot of pet emergencies, they happen after hours, right? So you can use the poison hotlines. That might be of benefit. But I think that knowing what you have in your garden and, and being cognizant of what those symptoms might look like can help you. So, Mike, do we have any questions so far that we're kind of moving on a little bit? Nope. Okay. So these are the top 10 toxic plants according to the ASPCA. Now, these are the top 10 toxic plants. These are not the top 10 plants that have caused a toxin in a pet. Okay, so this is just what they consider the top 10. And as you'll see, there's quite a few of these. The bottom row, the second from the right is a plant that's generally in a house plant. I think it's called a peace lily. It's not a true lily. It's not like the lily that's bad for cats, but it is often a house plant. And so a couple of these can be house plants. So these, so if you are concerned at all, this again is where you want to direct your phone calls if you can't get a hold of a veterinarian for you. So I'm guessing there's no questions, Mike?
Sorry, I had my microphone turned off. See if there are any new ones from. Okay, yeah, one question. Know anything about tall purple verbena? My dog eats it constantly.
Yeah, well, verbena is on the toxic plant list. It's the berries. So after the, oh, excuse me, verbena. I'm thinking of lantana. I'm so sorry. I don't know why those two I have cross wires in my brain. Verbena. No, I am not aware that verbena is a problem at all.
Okay, that's good. Any other questions, anyone?
Okay, that's pretty good because that was kind of crazy information. But okay, so why don't we move on to keeping our gardens safe from our pets? That's what probably you're hoping I'm going to give you all these amazing ways, but unfortunately, they're all things that you probably already know. I'm just going to reiterate them for you. So how do we keep our gardens safe from our pets? Dogs. Dogs dig. Dogs crush plants. They run through plants. They chew leaves and many times consume vegetables in our vegetable garden. Cats. Cats do kind of the same thing. They smash things. They tend not to eat as much stuff, but they smash, they run through. And the biggest naughty thing that cats do that we all are aware of is that they use our seed beds as bathrooms. So that's pretty icky. So what are we supposed to do? The number one thing is fencing, exclusion. We have to exclude them from the areas that we want to protect. So if you have like a vegetable garden, like in this picture, inside, your fenced yard, and your pets are, inside this yard, the best way to keep your vegetable garden safe is to fence your pets out. Now, this is not going to keep a cat out, obviously. This is for dogs. So we'll talk a little bit about cats. I mean, cats are able to jump over that, of course. So we'll talk a little bit. Fencing out, dealing with cats and dealing with dogs, obviously, is sometimes similar, but oftentimes different. You can use some type of barrier fence that just isn't really, you can think of them, barrier fences are just more to let them know, jump over. It doesn't mean they couldn't crawl through, but and it could be something very decorative. It just, it says my internet connection is unstable. So hopefully we don't have an issue here. So barrier fencing. Portable fencing. I use this a ton in my garden. So this is fencing that you can move around as you need it. You could put sections of this around a new plant that you put in. It's portable. It's easy to move. These are the ones that I use in my vegetable garden. So this is one of my dogs. She's a 1.5-year-old. And this is to teach them, this is this winter, and you can't tell the difference between a path and a vegetable bed in winter in my garden. The only way, I mean, I know where they are, but my pets don't know where they are. So I fence off the planting bed so that they go on the paths. And truthfully, in the past, I don't know about my 2 dogs now, but in the past, leaving these up for a couple of years in winter, and then the plants kind of protect themselves in the summer, most of them, or I leave the fencing up, they learn where the paths are. And as long as they're not, being really rowdy, they will actually go on the paths after a while. They don't cut through. Now, I don't know about that black and white one. She's a pretty rowdy breed, personality. I also use concrete reinforcing wire, and that's what I use for my tomato cages. And I just open my cages up and put them over seed beds, and that works too. So that's another way to designate where your planting beds are and where paths are to try to train. And then get creative. This is actually a trash can that I found at a thrift store. Upside down over a new plant. My dogs were cutting this corner, and I put a plant there, and so I put a little barrier there. And you can put these, as long as the sun, the light can get in and you can water it and stuff, it will grow fine there. And once it gets bigger, then they probably will not run through it. So these are, temporary things. This obviously isn't something super attractive for your front yard, but but hopefully you don't have to use it for a long time. There's last year it was all the rage on social media using those wire trash cans, the little small ones that you could buy at the 99-cent store to protect little seedlings from not only birds but also from being stepped on. And so that's something you just kind of have to think about, things to protect the young plants before they get bigger. Also, dogs want to look through the fence, right? They want to know what's on the other side of the fence. So if they can't see through, they're going to be racing up and down the inside of your perimeter fence. So think about creative ways to let them have a window to the outside that they can see what's going on, and they're not racing up and down, your fence line on the inside. Make hardscape that gets to these little windows so that they're not traipsing through a flower bed to be able to see out. And that has, I think, works really well. If they hear something on the other side of the fence, they want to know what's going on, right? How about not putting your plants right up next to the fence? So have hardscape that's near the fence if you have a solid fence and you don't want openings in it, or you can't put openings in it. So use hardscape at the edges. So if your dogs are running up and down along the fence because they hear noises. They're not destroying your planting areas. If you have areas where your dogs always seem to run, then make that a little sidewalk. I mean, not a concrete sidewalk necessarily, but make that an area that you don't put plants in. Make that a mulch area, or a decomposed granite area or something like that. If they insist on that being a path, then maybe you just need to, give in and give them a path. Electric pet fencing. Now, this is a very controversial subject that I'm going to hopefully not really get into. But I had a number of clients that asked about pet fencing when I was in practice. And they were primarily interested in pet fencing for the perimeter of their property. So rather than have an actual fence, they wanted an electric fence. And that is how they are mainly used. But they can be used also for inside your yard to quote unquote fence off little areas. It is complicated though. The way electric fences work is there is a wire that is usually always buried a number of inches, underground, depending on the wire and the system that you purchase. The pets have to wear a collar. The collar picks up a warning tone when they get near the wire. If they get over or close a certain amount close to the wire, they get a static correction. They get a shock. There's a whole training process that goes along with using these fences. Obviously, you have to train a dog to know what the warning tone is. And also, if they do cross the wire, then they will get shocked coming back and they won't get a warning tone. So that's one of the that's one of many issues with these invisible electric pet fencing. So it also has to be a continuous wire connected to the control center. So for you to have it in just a certain area in the yard, it's a little complicated. So there are a lot of these systems do talk about doing just specific island areas, but it isn't a true island for the wire. So I think that's about all I'm going to say about electric fencing. It is a little bit difficult. Okay, cats. Cats love to dig in flower beds, that sort of thing. So we have to think about horizontal fencing for cats, not vertical fencing. I use this a lot in areas where my cats want to dig, where I don't, I have bare ground. I don't want them using that area as a potty area because it's, like near a stairs, or it's in, heaven forbid, my vegetable garden. I certainly don't want them in there. So I use a lot of horizontal fencing for cat protection. You can use it flat on the ground. This one is kind of almost flat, and it looks like this is like a squash or a cucumber plant or something that's coming up. You can cut little holes in it so the plant can actually grow up through this chicken wire. You can use bigger wire that has bigger openings in it, that sort of thing. So that works pretty well for cats. There is a cat fencing. This is a perimeter cat fencing. So this would be like a solid fence around the perimeter, is the way that these are actually sold as, because you can see by that arrow, it's a part that bends down. So if the cat tries to climb the fence, that part bends down and they can't get over the fence. if you could use this inside your fence, inside a fence yard, to keep cats out of like a vegetable garden. So it would be the perimeter of the vegetable garden inside a yard. So that's just something to think about. I'm running out of time, so I'm starting to talk really fast. Repellents. So let's talk really quickly about repellents. This is one that I do think works pretty well. This is just a sprinkler with a motion detector eye. So it picks up motion. When it picks up motion, the sprinkler comes on. Works darn well for cats. You have to position them so you're not watering the house, you're not watering your neighbor, you're not watering your car, that sort of thing. So you have to be cognizant of where you're placing them. And you have to remember, of course, to turn them off before you are going to work in the garden. There are some sonic barriers on the market for cats. The only study I could find felt that they were about 22% effective for some cats. That's not very high percentage, I don't think, for paying for one of these sonic barriers. The ASPCA does recommend coffee grounds and citrus peels. I could find no evidence that worked, and no scientific evidence that worked. Anecdotal evidence, yes, that works to repel cats. Both of these things are safe in the garden. Coffee grounds are good for the garden, so I think it's worth trying, if you have a cat problem. There are a ton of repellents granules that you can buy. I could find absolutely no scientific evidence that any of these work on dogs and cats. I found one paper that talked about coyote urine granules, which, believe it or not, you can buy online, will repel rabbits. So I thought that was, kind of interesting. There's also one for treated sewage sludge for deer, but I don't know how you would get treated, sewage. And then training. You can train dogs to do almost anything. Maybe not this, but you can train them to do almost anything. You can train cats too. Cats are just a whole lot harder and take a lot more time, but cats are totally trainable. So this would be a potty yard. You could train your dogs to potty only in this spot. You can, male dogs, you're going to need some kind of vertical surface. Cats, make a seed bed for them. Bury, put catnip nearby, that sort of thing. Allow them to have a place that looks like a seed bed that really isn't a seed bed for you. Diggers. Oh my gosh. It kind of depends on the breed. Well, it also depends on the age. So young dogs tend to be bigger diggers than older dogs. Both of my dogs were diggers when they were, puppies. Neither of them dig right now at all. Terriers, they're diggers. I mean, that's what they do. I mean, that's what they were bred to do, is dig into holes and as for, rodent control and that sort of thing. So if you have terriers, oh my gosh, try to train them to areas where they're allowed to dig. There's also research that shows that dogs that see you digging in the ground will dig in that area. So heaven forbid, do not allow them to see you planting bulbs, okay? We already talked about that. So teaching them to dig in certain areas of the yard, keeping that ground so it is conducive to digging, burying toys in that part of the ground, that brings them over to that area. And finally, sometimes we just have to give up perfection, right? We just have to learn forgiveness, give up perfection, and live with our pets. Okay, sorry I had to talk so fast at the end, but I was running out of time. Are there any questions, Mike, that we need to?
No, no new questions, Treva.
Wow,
So
okay.
yeah, no, you've answered all the questions.
Either I answer them or everybody's asleep. I don't know.
Yeah, no, I don't think so. All right. Thank you. Thank you so much. That was an excellent talk.
Great.
If you all hang in there just a minute, I want to tell you about next session, and it's going to be special. Um, Before that, let me say that Treva does a garden chat every
Oh, thanks,
first
Mike.
Saturday of the month by Zoom. You can find the link, I think, on the Master Gardener website. It's
Mhm.
excellent. You get her insight every month about what's coming up in the coming month. Concentrates on vegetables, but probably a little bit of everything. So,
Only edibles. Nope, only edibles.
okay, only edibles. All right. All right. So I want to tell you about next session, which is March 12th, and it is going to be in person. And it will be at the Blanchard Room at the Davis Yolo County Library on 14th Street, and at a somewhat different time from 4 to 5.
Hmm.
The speaker is going to be Richard Carbon, who is a professor emeritus at UC Davis, and he is an internationally recognized expert on, wait for this, plant communication. Yes, plants actually do communicate. And his research, um, which was very controversial in the beginning and is not so much anymore, is to show how and when plants communicate. So, largely using pheromones, maybe some other ways, probably to warn other plants about an insect attack. That's very well documented. And one of the really interesting things is he's found that plants will pay attention to warnings from their close relatives, such as parents and siblings, more than plants that are more distantly related. So, I
Wow.
mean, this is really fascinating stuff. If you want to get a little preview, there are a couple of articles on the newsletter from last year. If you go into the website and search on his name, those should come up. So it's Richard Carbon, Karban. But again, that's going to be in March. It's going to be in person at the Blanchard Room in Davis at the library from 4 to 5. So I hope you can make the little extra effort to come. It'll certainly be worth it. And tell your friends because we want to have a good showing for him. So.
Awesome.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Treva. Thanks for coming, everybody. And hopefully we'll see you in on March 12th. And if not, March 26th, we'll be back to Zoom. So, all right. Thanks, Treva. Bye,
Thanks, Mike.
everybody.
Thank you. Thank you.